Paper copies of old sermons are kept in the office, as well as in that box and in that binder on the side table. Last spring, Dorothy asked me to scan the paper copies to make electronic copies. She wanted me to create a compact disc record of those sermons so she could preserve the sermons, but throw out the paper copies, and create about a half drawer of empty space in the office binder. The sermons go back to Susan's first sermon as our congregation's minister in 1996. Since 1996, we have about sermons from about half the Sundays each year. There are also a few from the founding of this congregation in 1989, and even earlier sermons from the 22nd Street Church, and some other churches as well. All told, I've scanned about 500 items. More file space is surely a tangible good, but why keep records of old sermons, paper or electronic? Are they worth keeping? You know, the Lockhorns have similar problems. How many of you know the Lockhorns from the comic strip by that name? I see a few. Very good. Well, they're a married couple who were always arguing and putting each other down. One day, the Lockhorns were cleaning Mr. Lockhorn's workshop, and Mrs. Lockhorn comes across an old, rusty electric drill. It doesn't work when she plugs it in, so she asks her husband why he keeps a drill that doesn't work. To answer, he draws himself to his full height and says, "Loyalty." Is that why we keep old sermons? Out of loyalty to those who preach them? Another reason, of course, is that someone might remember a past sermon long after it was given and want a copy. That happened to me 2 years ago in 2009 when I remembered a sermon I had heard 5 years before in a Methodist church. I phoned the church, talked with the office administrator, and found they had only audio tapes of the sermons. And I had to get the minister's approval in order to listen to them. Eventually, I got approval and was told, and the administrator opened all the cabinets in which years of taped sermons were stored. She told me that I was the first person ever to access them. And if I found the sermon, I could take it and keep it. Wow, I thought all of those sermons in all of that space, and no one had ever been interested in replaying them. Why store them? Is it really worth it for that one person every 5 or 10 years who might want a copy? Well, it was for me because I used information from that sermon to talk here about spiritual diversity. So, inspiration for someone who is preparing a new sermon is another reason for keeping copies of old sermons. Christiana was inspired in that way, which is why I read her words earlier. Of course, not everyone is interested in sermons. One person I know here said that they come on Sunday to experience the community, not for the sermons. Because sermons are repetitious, and that person said they had heard them all before. In truth, sermons can seem repetitious, because ministers and the worship associates generally plan according to what's called the liturgical year. There's always an Earth Day sermon, a Mother's Day sermon, a Christmas sermon, and so on. In fact, the UUA website lists 50 special days in the liturgical year. That's 50 out of 52 Sundays for which the topic can be pre-planned every year. No wonder sermons can seem repetitious. Nonetheless, I'm reminded of a congregation that called a new minister. He preached the first Sunday, but then was inundated with committee meetings and pastoral duties. So he didn't have time to prepare new sermons. For the next 3 Sundays, he preached the very same sermon he had given the first Sunday. Finally, the board members had enough, and they went to the district executive to complain. "What did he preach about?" asked the executive. None of the board members could remember. So the executive advised, "Let me preach the same sermon one more time." Do we need to hear each sermon 5 times to get the message? And what message do sermons give anyway? What are they for? What are the functions of sermons? The opening words listed 8 functions. Later on in their book, Thematic Preaching, an Introduction, Jane Rzepka and Ken Sawyer elaborate on those 8. Sermons may attempt to heal, to tend the institution, to move to action, to build the loving community, to inspire a sense of spiritual wholeness and well-being, to teach a religious tradition, to stimulate thought, and to startle, awaken, or amuse. On any given Sunday, a sermon is apt to try to accomplish several of these tasks in differing degrees. Actually, I think there are more than 8 functions, but that's all I will have time to illustrate by quoting sermons that we've heard. Remember, through all of this, we're trying to figure out why to keep old sermons. First, the healing function. Here's what Rzepka and Sawyer say, and I'm quoting. "Sermons that seek to heal look and sound more as we do when we try to offer comfort. The job is to say out loud the congregation's feelings of pain, to reassure and soothe, to offer perspective, and to point people to sources of strength and solace beyond or deep within themselves." We had an example of a healing sermon this year after the events of January 8th. Let me remind you what Reverend Joy said to end her sermon on January 9th. I'm quoting Joy. "During the winter holidays each year, which we've just gone through, people tend to become more gentle, generous, and compassionate with one another, and more grateful for their many blessings. And this year, in the aftermath of the shocking tragedy we were all confronted with yesterday, we will surely see many more acts of kindness and generosity than are usual, as we attempt to heal as a community and as a nation. Perhaps we can work on extending the spirit of civility and graciousness beyond a seasonal and remind ourselves as often as possible to treat others with gentleness and civility, with love and compassion in all our interactions. Another function for sermons is to tend the institution. One of the most obvious of this kind of sermon is the one that kicks off our stewardship pledge drive just before spring each year. In the past, Susan gave sermons about money. There are 6 of those among the sermons I've scanned. This year we had a different format, and Joy gave a sermon called Someone with Skin during our brunch. Here's what she said. Commitment is what it takes to fund your collective dream of a strong religious body which offers spiritual support, intellectual challenge, solace in times of need, and joyful celebration of life to all who come here. A congregation which works to carry out its principles of social justice and freedom of belief, which strives to reverse the forces of violence, bigotry, and irrationality in the world, which educates children in these basic principles, and which offers you caring companions for your life journeys.